Hello, good afternoon. My name is Jamie Williamson. I'm the Executive Director of the International Code of Conduct Association based here in Geneva. And it's a privilege to welcome all those who are listening to our first webinar of the year on achieving ICoCA certification and why the investment. The purpose of this webinar is very much to have a sort of an interactive and exchange and discussion on the certification element of the work of the association by bringing a number of companies and a certification body and academics working in this particular field to discuss a number of issues linked to the certification process at the industry level with prior security companies. For those of you who are not familiar with the certification function of the association, it's one component of the work of the association in overseeing the implementation of the International Code of Conduct, which was signed and adopted in 2013, and the association being the body which governs the implementation and oversees the implementation of the Code of Conduct, which started operating in 2016. Certification is a complement to our other functions, which are linked to monitoring and complaints, which no doubt will come up during the conversation we have over the next hour or thereabouts. The certification process in two lines at this stage, before we go into the sort of discussion with our panelists, is very much focused on a two-tier approach, working with industry standards, a couple of ISO standards, as well as an ANSI PSC 1 standard that security companies that become members of the association need to certify to, after which they can apply to be certified by the association as a secondary step. Member companies to the association, many of which are actually signatories to the Code of Conduct, when they become members to the association, have approximately 2 years or thereabouts to fulfill that certification requirement. So in the interim, they are seen as transitional members, and once certified, they're fully certified members of the association. Over the past few years, there have been discussions with regard to the certification process, to its added value, to the benefits that it brings to companies, clients, regulators alike, to the challenges that companies face in achieving certification, to the issues surrounding the entire certification process and the role of certification bodies, to potential gaps that there might be in the certification arena. And so our work and part of this discussion with our members and for the attendees is very much to try to bring to the table some of the key issues that we've identified over the past couple of years, and also to identify some of the objectives that we want to work on with our membership to make certification a successful process and a core element of the implementation of the Code of Conduct. As part of the webinar, we sort of framed the discussion around sort of 5 key questions, but these are sort of generic questions to hopefully guide the participants, which I'll introduce in a few minutes. For those of you who want to ask questions during the webinar itself, there is an element of sort of a Q&A component on your screen where you can actually put in questions in writing, and we will then put them to the panelists during the course of the webinar. The framing questions that we put as part of this webinar were 5-fold. The first question was, why should private security companies in the first place become ICoCA certified members? Secondly, what are the risks of not becoming ICoCA certified? Third, what does ICoCA certification entail? How long does it take? And how much does it cost? Maybe to demystify some of these processes. And then how does ICoCA certification fit into the broader certification landscape more broadly? We'll try to address most of these questions in a generic sense, but also I think based on the profile of those who are the panelists for this particular session, go into more of the technical issues, but in a sort of practical sort of perspective. The panelists are 5-fold. I'll introduce them fairly quickly, and I'll allow each of the panelists, when they take the floor the first time, to present themselves, to explain who they are, who they work for, and a little bit their interest in this matter, and addressing the questions. The panelists also come from different parts of the world. So we have Peter Snell, Director of Centurion Security, SA in Guatemala. We have Jess Marlow, Operations Support Manager, LGS in Nigeria. We have Conrad Thorpe, CEO of Salama, Fikira in Kenya. We have Tony Chattin, Director of MSS Global in the UK. We have Rebecca DeWinter-Schmitt from American University, but I presume is still in Berlin. And we have the Secretariat here in Geneva. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to our panelists, and I think to start the discussion, I'll first move over to the security participants. So I'm looking here specifically at Peter, Jess, and Conrad, and to give us their sort of company perspective. And overall, the question is, why certification as a way to raise security standards within companies and the industry writ large? What is interesting and why is it so important for companies to invest the time and the capacity and resources to achieve certification, both the big picture as well as the small picture? Given that we're on the webinar, I'll actually ask Peter maybe to go first, followed by Jess and then Conrad. And if each of you could also introduce yourselves for the sake of the attendees. Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, hello everybody from all over the planet at the moment. My name is Peter Snell. I'm the director and founder of Centurion Security. Centurion's a security company, full service security company based here in Guatemala in Central America. And basically, we've been in operation since 2014, so quite relatively new in real terms. With the question about why private security companies should become certified with the International Code of Conduct, I believe the reason why is the potential value that being certified can give your company. But it's part of a contractual requirement, as is the case with one of our clients, for example. Then obviously that helps you to establish yourself more firmly in the market. Obviously that's client dependent, hence the potential aspect. Or whether or not you're actually supporting other certified members. For example, here in Guatemala, being British, being ex-military, I have a lot of contacts all over the world. And what I find is a lot of people reach out because of the Spanish speaking element. They reach out for support, not just in Guatemala, but throughout Latin America. And of course, having that certification of ICoCA, that helps us to be identified as working off the same principles and standards and being accountable. And that works both ways. And also from my perspective personally, here in Guatemala, it gives us a different profile from all the other security companies that are actually here and established. Unfortunately, there's very few security companies that actually operate legally within the remits of the law. And they go unchecked, unaccounted for, unaudited. And there's this sort of attitude within Guatemala and a lot of Central America where, oh, well, what's cheap is best because they're all as bad as each other. And we're starting to break the mold on that slowly but surely. And we've slowly developed ourselves, built up a good client base, and we're starting to get the confidence in the market, and that's helping us. So that's where basically I believe the value potentially is with the ICO. Obviously, that all falls back down to the ISO, because even though maybe the International Code of Conduct isn't as recognized, ISO certainly is.
Thanks, Pete. Very useful. So, I mean, I take note here of the differentiation as well as the added value that you see, certainly with regard to certification, and of course the need for sort of greater awareness in that regard. If I could then turn the floor or the mic over to Jess.
Hi everyone, I'm Jess from LPS in Nigeria. We're a private security company. We've been operating since 2010, delivering onshore and offshore security services solely in Nigeria and the Gulf of Guinea. My role is to support the operations department in delivering our services and to maintain our compliance within the industry. Operating in Nigeria has its interesting aspects, and a lot of clients can be fairly skeptical about operating in such a volatile or challenging environment. So I think to reassure clients that aspects such as human rights and compliance to industry standards can certainly be very reassuring when they're entering a new operational environment. We first became a signatory to ICoCA years ago, and since 2015 we have become member status, in a transitional status actually, until we become certified. The main areas of interest for ourselves are discussing what value does becoming a member add to our business, what the benefits are and how and when we're likely to see these, and how it's going to be filtered through to the clients so that they know that it's an important part of their due diligence procedure. So that's about it from me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jess. And I think building on what Peter's mentioned there as well, there is, of course, the sort of the value that you're looking for, and of course the point that's will most probably come up again during this webinar of the role and responsibility of clients in terms of recognition and identification of standards and the appropriate work that companies do in that regard. Conrad, can I turn the mic to you?
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Good evening from Central Rift Valley here in Kenya, where I'm extremely lucky. You can see it's nightfall. I'm not going to give you a David Attenborough run through of what's just happened, but I have just had a herd of Birchall's zebra run past the back of me. I hope those of you that are sharp-eyed managed to see them. I don't think you're here to watch zebra on this particular program. You're more interested in perhaps listening to whether or not we've got something of value to add to this. And I feel quite strongly about ICoCA, and I feel very strongly about certification. I exist on a continent where having international recognition, having awards which are certified through companies which are accountable and which work under best practice across the world is incredibly important to us. Being able to maintain our standards under consistent risk and threat, and that comes from all sorts of significant areas for us, whether it's in the multiple countries that we operate in across Africa and increasingly Asia, and indeed even this year we've operated in 3 European countries. So the company is very international in that respect. Company was formed in 2005, and initially we grew slowly in Africa and steadily. I've heard the term full service. There isn't an aspect really of our business that I can think of where we don't operate in the risk management domain. There's a lot of our business that we do is in what I would call the special services domain. It is in some areas where there's incredibly high risk, and many people will be accustomed to that given the industry that you're in. Because we face significant challenges, particularly in Africa, but in some other parts of the world, from areas such as corruption, and from potential blocks that are put in place by governments. It is incredibly important to us to, as I said at the beginning of this and the outset, to have those items in place which give us recognition. And it's, for us particularly, we've got 5 ISOs, 9001, 14001, 18001, 28788, and in addition to that, we've got 28007, which is in the maritime domain as well. Those management principles that come through that afford us a greater feeling of compliance, which is incredibly important given the level of the clients that we support. And no doubt the listeners will have similar feelings to that, because of course, clients wish to be reassured that companies are genuine and have good management structures in place, are sound financially, assess risk in all respects, not just for them, but they assess their own risks and so forth. And coming under their ICoCA banner gives us that. Like the young lady, Jess, Marlow just mentioned earlier, she said that she had been members of ICoCA for some years, and the predecessor of yours, and I know it's somewhat different. And I recall signing that document in Geneva in 2010 as well. And it was important for us. I've always, and I think it's important for anybody in a position as a CEO or any management position, frankly, or as a director, to understand and fully embrace where you can strengthen your company's attributes. It's not a string of medals that I'm wearing across my chest. It's much more important than that. I have the ability with this to be able to stand up, look my clients in the eye and say to them, if you want to know more about us, you can go to ICoCA and you can ask them for information concerning Salama Fikira. If you want to know about our ABC policies, you can go across and talk to Trace International in Maryland in USA. And you can see everything that we've produced on the company. And anybody listening to this webinar can do exactly the same. If you want to see that we have our German licenses and our flags and our flag state licenses and so forth, again, you can go onto those websites and find that. And in this respect, ICoCA for me is incredibly important, particularly as the company expands internationally. I need to have that international aspect, which affords me some degree of status and protection. And I think increasingly in a highly competitive world where many of us here are competing against each other, and not necessarily down where I am in Africa, but certainly in other parts of the world, I think it's important to have that sort of value-added product with you. I also feel, and I just wanted to quickly glance at my notes here, that this isn't about self-regulation. It's far from it as far as I'm concerned. It's much more about seeing the industry collectively and working together to a common standard which sees us, those of us that wish to be part of this industry and do the best we can at it, come together in an information sharing status and platform such as we have here. And that's one of the areas that gives me significant confidence there as well. We operate on a continent where there are hundreds of languages. It's important for us to be able to speak a single language that comes through ICoCA, where we get that. But we operate on a continent where Kiswahili is incredibly important, Arabic is incredibly important, French is important, so is English, plus the plethora of African languages and Asian languages where required when we're in Asia, for example. And I think having that single medium that delivers a single language with a single message, which is trusted as well, is important, certainly for us, and I take great pride in it. And I hope that you'll understand, but that perhaps it's worth looking at. It doesn't cost you anything, I don't believe, to register initially, but you can get details on that. I'm not here to sell ICoCA in that respect. I'm here just to say, how has it benefited us at Salama Fikira International across the world where we operate? And I feel it's given us increased credibility. I believe it's given us an increase in our compliance, which sits very neatly along with our ISOs and the other status and awards and accolades that we have, and I feel that it would benefit others as well to have that too. But I'm open to discussion and very open to questions as well that may come from others, because of course there is a cost attached to it, and some people may find that off-putting, and I think it's important that there is a cost attached to it as well, because the company has to be able to demonstrate that it can't just, there is always a commercial aspect to anything that we do in business. We're here as private security companies, as private risk management companies, as special services companies, actually delivering commercial practices across the world. And in our case with ICoCA, it does apply across the string of countries that we are registered in and we are operating in legally. And I think that's an important point. Without dwelling too much, that's an introductory gambit from me. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Conrad. If zebras do go past again, do let us know. It's getting a bit dark. But I take note, of course, there. I think you're joining in many ways what Peter and I think Jess was saying with regard to the recognition of the standard and what it actually represents in terms of achieving minimum operating standards. And hopefully, again, this is another point that goes back to what both Peter and Jess were saying, the question of client recognition, but also the differentiation in the respective marketplaces where there might be a less developed system or levels of corruption. We've heard that come up a couple of occasions so far as well. Before giving the floor maybe to Tony Chattin from MSS Global, one of the certification bodies that works on these particular standards and with ICoCA, just looking at a couple of questions that we have here coming through. I think the first one, and this was already mentioned by two or three, well, I think all three of you so far, with regard to the confusion in the markets regarding signatory status of the Code of Conduct and members of the Code of Conduct. I think this is, a vital point to underscore. We do have, I think it's approximately 700 companies that signed up to the Code of Conduct. They've made commitments under that Code of Conduct. But in terms of the oversight and the implementation of those commitments, that takes effect when those companies effectively become members of the association. So yes, there's subscription to the commitments on the Code of Conduct, but those companies that have joined the association, I think it's a little bit what all three of you were saying, have taken that additional commitment to being open to some level of monitoring, greater evaluation, and going through the certification process as well. So signatory status is not the same as member status. Tony, I'm going to sort of put a question to you now as well, because of course something we have heard over the past couple of years and in my time with the association is very much, the certification process can be quite technical, can be quite complex for many. And there have been, elements raised with regard to costs, to access to the processes, and exactly, what does it entail? And then linked to that, From your perspective, and without trying to sell your business either, but much more in terms of certification and standards, what is the benefit for companies ultimately to become certified? Do you see an added value in the certification process, ICoCA as well as industry, for companies as part of their operations? Tony, floor is yours. And if you could also introduce yourself for the attendees.
Okay, thanks very much, Jamie. Yeah, Tony Chattin, I'm the MD of MSS Global. And while we're a UK registered company, we're unique as a specialist international certification body auditing private security companies and private maritime security companies globally. We're internationally accredited to certify companies to ISO 18788 and PSC1 and also ISO 28007. As well as the normal suite of other ISOs, such as 9001. Within our team, we're able to draw on a pool of 7 different languages at present. These include Spanish and Portuguese in Central and Latin American region, through to Urdu and Arabic in the Middle East and Central Asia. Our clients range, and there's lots of discussion spoken about it, but just as a flavor, our clients range from small startup companies of just 2 or 3 people through to the world's largest privately owned security company. So taking Jamie's baton, what does certification entail? In our experience, one key factor drives success, and that is leadership. From that comes really the cultural adoption across the company, and that takes time and investment of resources. A management system is, I mean, simply put, and there's a real risk of people seeing it as some sort of mystic phrase. It isn't. Simply, it's a reliable, conscious methodology that helps top management deliver their business objectives through ensuring responsibility and accountability to run the company is delivered effectively. It helps ensure the company repeatedly delivers a quality service to your clients and effectively manages your people and your relationships with the local communities within which you operate. Think of the international standards really as an internationally recognized best practice framework, hence why certification that you meet those requirements in the standards have such power. It's a formal recognition and a public affirmation that you're meeting international best practice expectations, and therefore increases your client's confidence in your ability to deliver compared to a company not certified, and hopefully supporting your desire then to become a long-term partner for them. This is also why certification to one of the recognized ISOs by an accredited CV is such a fundamental step towards becoming a full ICoCA member. It provides a public statement of confidence in your ability to meet those requirements in the standards and therefore go a long way to meeting the obligations under the code. So what's actually entailed? Well, the first step really is your preparation. Your internal investment of time and effort is by far the greatest element of any certification activity. That is why leadership's are key. It keeps things moving forward. Effort spent in this first phase makes the rest much easier for you, believe me. You need to identify who on the leadership team is going to drive this. Identify who your functional leads are, such as finance, HR, operations, logistics. If that's just 2 of you and you've got multiple hats and you're sharing those, so be it. It doesn't really matter. But think about the functional leads. And then as a team, identify how you already meet the requirements in the standards by what you're doing in your normal day-to-day business. And from that, where you have gaps and the need to adjust your approach and who's going to lead that topic in your company. Preparation is a key area where we've developed some online accessible education and gap analysis support to help you cost effectively develop that understanding. But it comes down to your leadership, really driving this. Because once you're prepared or you're moving towards completing your preparation, we can then go into the formal certification side of things. And in sheer time terms, our involvement as a certification body is much smaller than your preparation time. The amount of time we require, and therefore in brackets the cost, is directly driven by your size, the range of services you deliver, and where those services are delivered to your clients. So transparently using international auditing benchmarks. Each client we review separately. One size does not fit all. And the formal audit itself covers 2 stages. Stage 1 is normally at your head office, and it focuses on how you've designed your management system to help you deliver your business objectives, your security operations objectives, while meeting those international best practice requirements. And stage 2 is simply a verification that the design has been implemented from head office out to the points of service delivery and impact, which makes this really unique and adds real assurance rigor to the process, because we go out to the point of service delivery. We use a sampling approach, and this includes some site visits, interviews with your people and clients, and where appropriate, local communities, and reviews of records to verify what we're seeing and hearing is how your company normally operates. You're not just putting on a pantomime for the auditor when they turn up. And then upon successful demonstration of meeting the international best practice requirements, certification is awarded to you and normally lasts for 3 years, subject to a much smaller surveillance program within each year to verify everything remains on track. And that's about it. It's not a difficult or complex task. The key is your preparation and gaining the support to really understand your own company.
Thanks, Tony. I think very useful. I mean, in particular, I think the 2 points that you mentioned there as part of the certification process in terms of the preparation, and it's quite often something we hear from companies that it takes a lot to become certified, when in actual fact, it also takes a lot of preparation to become certified, and that being sort of, I think, the first element you emphasize. The second one, I think, is the leadership component. And that does come through quite often. It's not simply linked to the security industry. You even look at any other entities of how important the culture of appropriate leadership and leading by example. It's so very important to get the certification process going. I will reserve some questions on the certification issue to after Rebecca's intervention as well, because of course, when we look at certification, and maybe we can address this afterwards, there's always a question mark being asked about it being a snapshot in time. That it's looking at management systems only, that it's not taking it beyond that, and it's not necessarily adding value with regard to monitoring and oversight. So I'll give the floor now, or the mic, to Rebecca, who will come from, I think, a slightly different vantage point, as someone who's worked closely with the Code of Conduct and its development over many years, as well as with the industry standards, and has published fairly recently also on issues linked to certification. And very much a question for Rebecca would be, how do you see certification as a complement to other efforts to raise standards? Is it sufficient on its own, or does it need to work more closely with elements linked to monitoring and the likes? Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Jamie. Yeah, so I don't think I need to introduce myself. Thank you for the introduction. So in addition to the questions you just posed, Jamie, I was asked to speak to how to improve certification to reap the maximum benefit from becoming ICoCA certified, and then also to talk a little bit about how certification is part of a continual improvement process to becoming a more responsible and better managed company. But before I do that, I want to, and this is touching on one of your questions, Jamie, I want to place ICoCA certification within the broader ecosystem of what might generally be called responsible business conduct standards. And I think we're often very focused on our industry, and the standards relevant to us, but I think there are larger trends that are at play here. Within the last 2 decades, we've seen a growing expectation from governments, from investors, from employees, consumers, clients, that companies writ large, but in particular also private security companies, know and show that they're behaving in a responsible fashion and not harming humans and the environment through their business activities and their business relationships. And this trend really reflects, I think, a larger shift away, and this was mentioned earlier in the call, I think by Conrad, from what was previously perhaps termed self-regulation or voluntary corporate social responsibility or corporate philanthropy, towards really this emerging set of national and international business and human rights standards that build on international human rights and humanitarian law, but are also very much accompanied by transparency, oversight, and accountability measures. And the ICoCA reflects an example of this type of initiative. It builds, among other things, on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is the internationally agreed upon cornerstone laying out the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So I think that's important to bear in mind, that we need to see these management system standards, we need to see the ICOs, the code, and the association as really embedded in this evolving landscape of expectations upon companies. Now, I think one of the biggest advantages to conforming to and becoming ICOC certified, if done properly, because that's the big caveat, if done properly, you're not going to reap the rewards if you don't put in the work, is that, you know, it not only ensures, as Tony said, that you're going to be a better managed company. You know, it's going to help you, as others have said, demonstrate your conformance to standards to clients, help you avoid risks that could pose potential financial, reputational, legal liabilities. But I think for me, more importantly, it's going to help put your company on the pathway to developing the corporate culture and accompanying operating systems that will enable that cultural shift that's been referenced towards being an evidenced responsible business. And that's very important, an evidenced responsible business. In other words, it'll put your company in a position, thinking again to this larger landscape of standards, in a position to demonstrate its adherence to a wide range of emerging and hard and soft law standards. So, for example, it'll help you meet general human rights due diligence requirements that are increasingly finding their way into law. One can think here of the French duty of vigilance law. It'll help you deal with issue-specific due diligence standards, such as the UK Modern Slavery Act or various conflict mineral standards. Or it'll help you fulfill the multitude of emerging reporting requirements. For example, if you adhere to the Global Reporting Initiative or are required to report on other type of non-financial performance. So the standards, you know, the management system standards, the code, they certainly help you to evidence, you know, you as a responsible provider of private security services. But beyond that, it'll also help you meet a whole set of other standards that are really gaining traction. Now, that said, in order to reap the maximum benefit from certification, it is very important that certification not be treated as a kind of tick the box exercise. And here I'm going to point to some of the research that Jamie just mentioned that I've done recently with Thorpe and McLeod. It's just appeared in the most recent issue of the Business and Human Rights Journal. And what we did is we took a look at the time, 16 certified, ICoCA certified companies. And unfortunately, we found some very mixed evidence in terms of their conformance to the code and, of course, the underlying management system standards. So some companies, you know, I would say are probably doing the minimum they need to meet requirements, or in some cases, unfortunately, not meeting key requirements. So, for example, let me just give you a few quick snapshot of what we found. We found that in some instances, companies have really failed to evidence that senior level management commitment to standards, be it in the form of a human rights policy or a statement of conformance, and they're not really made publicly available on their websites. We saw some examples of companies that are not adequately communicating to stakeholders what they're doing to assess and address their human rights risks and impacts. And we found in some cases companies that have inadequate third-party complaints mechanisms available, and in a very few cases, none at all. And so along with that also, some companies are not doing a very good job of communicating information about the scope of their certification to management system standards. And the issue here is that the lack of information about commitments and conformance to standards and the failure to communicate transparently about the scope of the certification makes it challenging then for your clients to differentiate between you as a responsible provider and selecting you as one of the better performing companies. So it's really, you know, in one's own interest, one's, I would say, enlightened self-interest, to make sure that if you're going through the problem of getting certified, you know, and you want to evidence to your clients, then, you know, take it seriously, make sure that you're moving forward to really fully meeting those requirements and demonstrating that publicly. Also, I would say that if you don't, for example, have the required complaints mechanisms in place, you're not doing a very good job of managing your risk. Because if your employees, your subcontractors, and other stakeholders first don't know what your company's committed to, and if they do, they don't know how to share their concerns when your company or its personnel are not living up to those commitments, then you're really missing out on an opportunity to more effectively manage your risks. So that sounds very gloom and doom. Not meant to be. I mean, you know, if you look at the article overall, you know, there's definitely a positive performance, just, you know, a bit of a mixed performance. I think what we need to bear in mind, though, is that certification, it's a long-term, conforming to standards is a long-term process. Certification itself, I think, has to be viewed as a continual improvement process. It's about building up or adapting existing management systems you have in place over time. It's about sowing the seeds to attain that cultural shift that we were talking about. It's about ongoing training of your personnel. It's about awareness raising and engagement with external stakeholders. So all very much a process. So that said, how do you set yourselves up to basically doing certification right, so to speak? And Tony already touched on some of these things. I mean, the biggest thing I think is, as we said before, is that commitment from top management, you know, in the process, you know, preparing, undergoing, and maintaining your certification, that is actually properly resourced. It can't hinge on one person. One person can't be responsible for compliance solely. That commitment needs to be embedded throughout the company. The employees need to be aware of the commitments the company has made, as well as the contractors, and they have to understand what it means for their particular positions and responsibilities within the company. Another thing, this may sound obvious, Tony, I don't know if you'll agree with this, but read the code and read the standards. I'm always surprised how many companies who've committed to these standards actually haven't taken the time to read them. I don't know if they're the most exciting read, but I mean, definitely, you know, worthwhile, and understand what's required. That'll help you do that gap analysis where you then look to see what you already have and what you can build on. But I think it's also important to recognize that what you build on may need to be adapted, and I can give some examples later in the Q&A. And then I think also very importantly, don't be afraid to be transparent and communicate. Engage with a wide range of stakeholders. Listen to those who are inside your company, your employees, but also those external to your company who also might be impacted by your activities. And bring in the needed human rights expertise. Make sure that your, you know, whichever certification body you choose, that they have the necessary human rights expertise and their auditors and their audit team. And turn to the association for resources. I mean, the association just put out a really wonderful guide on developing company grievance mechanisms. Very, very straightforward, very friendly.
Okay. That's Rebecca. I lost you for the last second. Hopefully we're online, yeah.
We can go into more details during the Q&A, but I guess ultimately what is that,
Yeah, I think we've lost Rebecca for a second. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Am I back?
Yeah, you're back now. We just lost you for a second or two.
Okay, but that was pretty much, my last message was just that it's doable. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that, and you know, so we have time for Q&A. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think that's very, very useful, because I mean, it's always good, we pat ourselves on the back and say we've taken commendable actions in terms of raising standards. But it's also very important, I think, for all of us, and I think it echoes some of Conrad's comments in particular, that we also have to be open in terms of, you know, facing some criticism to address any shortcomings that we have with regard to the processes we've put in place and to the issues that we need to address. I'll go back to we've got a couple of questions coming online, but if I may maybe go back to, at this stage, Peter and Jess in particular, because one of the questions we've heard come up on a regular basis with regard to certification has been the access to certification bodies, to accredited certification bodies. And the two of you are operating in contexts where there may not be certification bodies that are actually accredited to work to these standards. So from your perspective, and maybe I'll give the floor to Jess first and then to Pete, how does the company go about delivering on, let's say, certification of a transitional member when it has limited access? Do you have options ahead of you? Have you looked at how to achieve certification despite the lack of certification bodies in your respective context? So Jess, may I give you the floor first?
Yeah, sure. Well, for our ISO certifications, we've been going through the recognised progression process with Tony at MSS Global, which has taken us through the foundation stage, the bronze stage, the silver stage, and now we're booked in for the final on-site audit, the gold stage, in June. And I would recommend going down a similar sort of path with MSS Global, who provide full-on support. You know, we're not in the same country as them. We do it all by Skype, all over the internet, and you know, I think their resources and their skill set that they've got to lead you through this, even if you're completely in the dark with any of it, you can be taken through it step by step so that you get a full insight and become fully aware of the process and they'll take you through it right till the end.
Mm-hmm. If I may just follow up on that, Jess, I mean, so your choice has been to go to a company, a certification body, which is outside of your zone of operations. Do you see the market evolving in your location in terms of a potential for accredited certification bodies operating in Nigeria, for instance, or is that still a long way away from reality?
Yeah, interesting. I would say most people will have more confidence because Nigeria is still evolving itself and coming up to various operational standards. I think clients and companies who are wanting to go through the certification stage will have more confidence in an international company as opposed to a local company within Nigeria, which goes back to international standards again, as opposed to, you know, local certifications.
Yeah. Thanks. And Pete, the same sort of set of questions for you, because you're operating in Guatemala and it's a non-Anglophone country. How do you perceive the sort of certification landscape and the opportunities for security companies, and particularly local security companies that want to achieve international standard recognition?
Well, I think obviously, firstly, there are no options here in Guatemala or Central America neither. The closest really being in the Americas is North America, so you're talking about the United States. But obviously my default setting being British, I looked towards my own shores and actually found Tony. We struck up a good conversation. I was interested in getting on board with the association completely, because I saw that, as I mentioned in my intro, as a vision for the company, as something that can set us aside more with the companies that currently exist in this region. And that's mainly down to a lot of corruption. I mean, we've even got the ex-president, vice president, and first minister in jail still from the last period. So, you know, they're all there for corruption purposes. So you can see how corrupt it is. It's just it's a culture of corruptness. So when we entered this market, I wanted to make sure that we looked different and we stood out above. And as I say, slowly but surely we're getting there. Hence, the certification was quite important for me. It was part of the vision of the company. And just reaching out with Tony, it was very simple. We had a couple of conversations on Skype with MSS Global. We set up a brief Q&A. I filled it out. He told me roughly where we felt we were. And then we started the process. 2 years down the line, we're still in that process of where we've got our certifications of ISO 18788, 9001, and the PSC1. So it was a great package for us. And obviously with the association, that's like the add-on, if you like. So that's like the gold standard where we want to be to make ourselves stand out. There is no other option within, as I say, Central America. The closest potentially is the States, but my default setting was to look closer to shore.
Can I offer, Jamie, just jump in? Because of, I mean, Peter was or Centurion were a vanguard company for us in Latin and Central America. Set aside Peter, we are now, or have, and Peter's next audit and his last audit is being delivered by a local resident, Guatemalan resident who speaks Spanish and Portuguese. And we now have a regional office based out of Guatemala to support that Central and Latin American market. So, and in addition to that, and there'll be people listening who have established relationships with existing accredited certification bodies in the more generic standards, there is an agility ability for them to work with us to do joint audits, which then helps that company retain that local link if they want to, whilst drawing on an international CB if they want to explore that. So it's not a one size fits all. It's a case of opening a dialogue and then designing a solution that best supports that PSC's context.
Yeah, so pragmatic in terms of approach, but I think recognition by everyone so far that the market's quite limited And so in terms of where the companies sort of reach out to and who they work with is very much dictated by the certification bodies presently in existence that can certify to those standards. Conrad, I hope I still have you online, and I think I want to move away a little bit from the certification technical aspect of the discussion to very much come back to, I think, something that most of you have already mentioned with regard to the added value of certification, the added value of standard raisings, but not simply from the perspective of the security company itself, but to me, one of the most important stakeholder groups out there with which we have little, I think, real sort of evolution of the past few years, but Rebecca mentioned a few sort of positive steps, is the clients. How do you generate the right kind of message for the clients, those that use your services in the provisional security services? How do you sell to them the fact that your standards mean that you are somewhat different and or better, for instance, than your competitors?
Well, thanks very much, and it's a good question, and it's one I'm keen to answer. Actually, one of the questions I see that featured also on the Q&A there also it draws in slightly and makes reference to why this would be an advantage vis-a-vis what they've already established. We need the ISOs and we need ICoCA. It's as simple as that, as far as I'm concerned. It's very difficult to communicate. Who do you communicate with when you're awarded an ISO? What we've got with ICoCA, just before I go on and answer your client question, is we've got a relationship with human beings, which are sitting in an office and are able to liaise with us. They're able to guide us. They're able to answer questions. They're available almost 7 days a week. And they can provide us with guidance, advice, direction in terms of where we should be going to, what we might be looking for, and so forth. And I'm particularly interested when I see questions such as that which you asked Jess, as could this work, for example, in Nigeria, where of course we're also represented and have a company as well, as we do in other parts of West Africa. How could that possibly be brought to bear so that there could be greater inclusion? And I quite like the way Tony jumped in there and just said, do you know what? It's good if we can do this. It's good if we can raise the standards of a local company, and I'm particularly interested in that. Recently here in Kenya, and where our headquarters is, for example, the Private Security Industry Regulation Authority was formed. And of course, the CEO from that group, or the Director General, came to my office in person, and he sat down and we briefed him on where we were. And he was particularly struck by the international dimension because he's regulating a single country. But the international dimension of what ICoCA brings and what the other ISOs bring, of course, is of great interest to him because he wants to do the best he can. In terms of bringing it round to your original question, because I wanted to actually just get that off my chest, if I may. The clients that support us, some of them, not all of them, but some of them come in person to our headquarters, and some of them go to our regional offices as well to check that we are who we are and what it says on the tin, for example. I was particularly interested with, again, Tony's comments on size and effectively range of services, which I call diversity of services, and indeed geography, which I call diversity of geography. Clients want to know that international companies which are not based in dare I say, joined up countries where there is a huge level of supervision. You may find it surprising, but we consider there's a considerable level of supervision in some of the European and North American countries, for example. Want to know that a company like ours, which is operating in the depths of Africa, for example, in Asia, is credible and can meet and do what it says. And I think that's where they look to us to go beyond just ISOs to say, and by the way, we're also part of a group and a family called ICoCA, which we feel gives us great confidence because of all the reasons I've just told you about there. And those clients are well known. They're extractive industry clients. They're clients in fast-moving consumer goods. They're clients in corporate security areas. They're clients in the offshore and maritime industries, of course, where we operate. They're clients in our information intelligence domains, etc. They're clients in all sorts of areas, and they get additional assurance from that. I hope that helps out.
No, very much. And I think that may want to mute the mic for a second. I think it also reflects, we just had a question come in as well with regard to the added value. If a company has endorsed the principles of the Montreux document, the International Code of Conduct, and it's certified ISO 18778, what is that potential added value that ICoCA certification brings to the table as well? And one dimension that you touched upon there was, of course, the international recognition. that you operate into a particular international standard, and the communication and the transparency that brings to the table. I'll revert quickly now also to Rebecca, because I've just noticed time is flying by, and I apologize. And Rebecca, going back to your comments in many ways, and I'd like to sort of maybe go to the client piece with you as well. Do you see there being a new kind of dialogue in the sort of the business human rights world with regard to security companies? And I say that from the vantage point that the dialogue we saw a few years ago with regard to security companies was simply as a service industry. One was looking at the consequences of their actions, for instance, from a use of force, detention, human rights perspective, and less at security companies as business entities in their own rights, as employers, individuals who are, and companies operating in environments and bringing a certain level of economic stability and sustainable development potential. Do you see the dialogue evolving, or are we still stuck a little bit in debate from about 10 or 12 years ago?
Well, I think it could definitely evolve further, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. But I do think there has been a real change. I mean, you have to remember, before the International Code of Conduct was penned, I mean, what did we have? We had the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And that was really, I mean, the security companies didn't have a place at the table. In fact, you know, this was obviously an issue for the extractive industry, but the security companies were really viewed as being part of the problem and not necessarily part of the solution. It was up to the extractive companies to tell the security providers what they expected. And I think what we're seeing now really is kind of a turning of the tables, where if you look at where the voluntary principles are and what's expected of their members, the association in the eyes of the business and rights community has really surpassed that. We've got the private security companies at the table. They made very early on very strong human rights and humanitarian law commitments. They committed to implementing an insurance framework, which is now the association with its governance and oversight capacities. And I think, you know, looking at the broader business and human rights movement, as far as multi-stakeholder initiatives go, I really can't stress enough that the association has some of the strongest, best commitments and assurance frameworks out there. And I think it's reflective of this evolution. And I think it's really positive that the security companies themselves can really claim to be those who have signed up to the code and actually gone through the membership process, those who've gotten certified, can really, I think, very legitimately claim to be industry leaders in terms of what they're doing. Now, that does not mean there's not room for improvement. You know, as I've said, there's definitely, it is a continual improvement process, but I think the conversation has definitely evolved.
Yeah. And on that, there's a question that came up with regard to your earlier comments. Do you think there's room for security companies to be doing more, and I'm looking at our membership in particular, as well as the association, to communicate better in terms of the content, the standards, the actions, the grievance mechanisms that have been put online, the complaints mechanisms, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did see that question. So I have to say that the research we did was intentionally focused to the publicly facing requirements of the standards, the fact that there needs to be a statement of conformance, committing oneself to human rights standards, the fact that there needs to be a publicly available third-party complaints and grievance mechanism. So that's what we were focused to. So definitely, to the extent that, you know, companies aren't meeting those standards, that is an issue very clearly about not communicating adequately and potentially not being transparent enough. I know transparency communication can be often raises concerns, you know, around putting too much information out there, opening oneself up to lawsuits and other types of liabilities, but it's a really important step to take. And you're not going to, as I said, you're not going to be able to effectively manage your risks if you're not getting that information from third parties about where they might have concerns in terms of how your company or your personnel are operating. So I can't say anything to what's actually kind of happening behind the scenes. Tony would have insight into that, but we really focused to what was publicly being put out there.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Rebecca. So I'm bearing in mind we have about 5 minutes left. I think what I'll do at this stage, rather than trying to sort of sum up sort of the webinar, I mean, I think this is a discussion we want to keep going for the months, if not years ahead, is maybe to give each of you another sort of minute or thereabouts to any sort of concluding remarks or comments, provocative or not, as the case may be, just as we wrap up the seminar. I'll suggest that this webinar, I'll suggest that we keep to the same order, maybe going with Peter, Jess, Conrad, Tony, and then Rebecca, and then time permitting, I'll say a couple of concluding words as well before we wrap up in about 5 minutes. If that works with you, Peter, any sort of last comments from your side?
I think basically what I personally would like to say, I know it's been touched on a little bit, and Jess certainly touched on it, is some sort of interaction from yourselves in the certification, in the association, and in supporting us with how we can make it more aware for clients of the importance of this. Because I, along with Conrad, completely believe that it is very important. And it's just it's that extra topping on top of your ISO certifications. So that's what my parting comment would be.
Thank you, Pete. So I take note of the client awareness and the client buy-in and the recognition bit, which is so very important to recognize the efforts. Jess?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute it. Yeah, I would agree with Peter saying the same, that the client recognition is of paramount importance to us, because, as I said before, no client at the moment has ever requested anything to do with ICoCA in the due diligence procedures. And so, as somebody else asked in the Q&A, how does being a ICoCA member give added value as opposed to just the ISO certification, which most clients seem to be satisfied with when they're doing their due diligence? What's going to make them take that extra step to request that private security companies do become ICoCA members?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jess. Conrad?
I was just dodging this large beetle. I don't know if you saw it. There's a large flying rhinoceros beetle here, but it's gone away now, thankfully. I think Peter and Jess have both said very sensible things. I mean, for me, I want to focus on the issue in this regard. Is it important nationally, as a company that supports a single nation nationally, to have ICoCA? And I think the answer to that question is yes. I also think the answer to the next question is that it becomes more important as you become multi-country, regional indeed, and potentially continental, or indeed international. So as soon as you start to leave that national domain as well and become increasingly international, there's no question for me that ICoCA is an incredibly useful tool. And what Jess says is perhaps right, and they won't all be seeking necessarily to see whether ICoCA actually helps you win those clients. But I have found, particularly with our significant clients, our super majors, etc., and those clients who are up there in the global standings, they're looking for increased levels of compliance, and this is one of those things that it provides. And that in itself may just be perception, but that's certainly the feeling I've got.
Good. Thanks, Conrad. Take note of that. Tony, and then Rebecca.
Yeah, quite simple. Meeting international best practice norms through accredited certification quite simply takes effort. There is no ISO in a box solution, just the same way as every company is a bit different. There's one single definer on the companies that gets through it, and it comes down to leadership, drive, and involvement, because they're the ones ultimately responsible for the performance and accountable for the performance of that company.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And Rebecca, last words before I conclude?
Yes, last words. So I definitely agree with everybody. It's very important that we raise awareness among clients about ICoCA and its value add, but I want to say specifically that question about what value add ICoCA offers above and beyond the certification management system standards. And I'm going to put on my human rights advocate hat briefly to do this, and that is that it is a multi-stakeholder initiative. I cannot stress that enough. From the perspective of any human rights organization, national, international, it makes a big difference that you've got the multi-stakeholder association behind that, engaging and monitoring, offering also its own complaints mechanism, looking into the certification, making sure that all the human rights components of the code are being met. It makes a big difference, and it's going to, should anything ever go wrong, because things will go wrong no matter what one tries to do everything right, it really gives you a good, sound defense to say we have done our due diligence in meeting those international standards that are expected of us. So that's it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rebecca. So I think I have approximately a minute to conclude this webinar, and I'm not going to try and summarize, I think, all the comments that were made by the panelists and the very rich discussion we've just had here. But certainly, I mean, I heard on a sort of regular occasion, I think, recognition on the part of everyone around the panel that we need to keep working towards raising those standards, internationally recognized standards. That ICoCA has a role to play in that regard, but we need to avoid any perception of it being a tick-in-the-box exercise. That to become certified, to become members, does take effort, does take preparation, requires leadership commitment, so then we can ensure that the standards are being met, and that we also need to be able to sort of profile the work of the companies and the association, the whole certification process, if it's done properly, with clients in particular. Because not only are we looking for client recognition, but we're also trying to achieve a level of responsibility on the part of those that are using security companies. Because when you have a demand, you have a supply, and if you have substandard supply, then we have potential human rights violations to cater for. And the last piece I'll mention here, to so I think piggyback on what Rebecca was saying, but I think it echoes also a comment that Conrad made at the very beginning, that we're not speaking here about industry self-regulation. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative, and there's sort of initiative which gives a certain level of credibility by bringing all the key stakeholders around the table. We still have a lot to do, so this is, I think, a first discussion from our perspective. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the 5 of you for having taken the time in the afternoon, in the evenings, dodging beetles and the likes, to be part of this webinar. I know we could have spoken for quite a lot longer. We have a number of questions which have come through, which we'll deal with in due course, and the communication lines are open. But this, I'm hoping, is the first of many such webinars. I hope you found it useful. So to the panelists, thank you, good evening, good afternoon, and to all the attendees, likewise. And we'll be ending the webinar now. Thank you.